Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Succeed with Variable Rate webinar. Thanks for taking the time to join us. My name is Chris Hawkins. I'm the Sales and Communications Manager with Crop Pro Consulting. I'll be your moderator for this session. Our plan is to be as efficient as possible with the time that you've given us. So we've pre-recorded each of our presentations. They should take about 40 minutes to go through. After that, we'll transition into a live Q&A session where we can answer any questions that you may have. You'll notice each of your microphones have been muted. That way we can stay focused and on track. We certainly do encourage your questions though. So as you think of them, simply press the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen and type your question into the submenu that pops up. I'll be sure to ask your questions on your behalf at the end of the presentations. For those of you not familiar with Crop Pro Consulting, we are a fully independent agronomy company and we started business in 2003. In 2008, we started doing variable rate using our SWOT maps technology. Today, we have 13 sampling trucks, 6 mapping trucks, and 25 staff throughout the province. Our client base continues to grow because people are starting to realize that we do have the expertise to help them succeed with variable rate. This is validated by the fact that we have over 95% client acre retention rate year after year. So we're proud to share some of that expertise with you today. But before we do that, we're going to ask Carrie DeGoyer to spend time explaining to you what SWOT maps are and why we need them. Carrie DeGoyer is our operations manager and also our senior precision agronomist. She's a professional agrologist and a certified crop advisor. She grew up on a mixed farm just outside of Sheeho and currently makes her home in Melfort, Saskatchewan. She got her university degree in agriculture from the University of Saskatchewan, where she focused on crop science. She joined Crop Pro in 2014, and part of her role includes providing precision agronomy service to Melfort and northern Saskatchewan. She truly is a proven SWOT maps agronomy expert. She's going to spend about 10 minutes going through what SWOT maps are, and then I'll introduce our main speakers. So without any further delay, please welcome Carrie DeGoyer.
Thank you, Chris, for the introduction. As you said, if you have any questions as we're going along here, feel free to type them in the Q&A at the bottom as you think of them, or you can wait till the end to ask them live. So what are SWOT maps? We are mapping soil potential, and the zone map that we make becomes the starting point for everything that we do next. It's the basis for our soil testing locations and fertilizer recommendations. So what we're doing is we're capturing soil, water, and topography attributes from your field. So take what you're seeing in your field and putting it in a zone map. So take what we're seeing in your field and putting it in a digital format so that we can manage each area appropriately. So along the bottom, I threw up 3 example SWOT zone maps from fields we work with, and they're overlaid on a 3D model of the field. And the 3D model is exaggerated a bit just to really accentuate where the water shedding hilltops are compared to the water collecting depressions in these fields. So you can see our legend here. Each color on the zone map is its own management zone. And right off the bat, you can see that all the high and dry hilltops are the zone 1 and 2s. They're managed differently than the rest of the field. And then on the other end of the spectrum, all the water collecting depressions in these fields are these dark green zone 9 and 10s. So you can kind of get a glimpse of what we're trying to do here. I threw up a picture of a field that has been summer followed. And if we all still summer followed our fields, this is very typical of what we would see. You could see this hill in the foreground, and there's a couple hills in the background here. They're all drier, they're lighter colored soil. They usually have a thinner topsoil depth. And then as you get into the depressions, it's usually wetter, higher organic matter levels here, thicker topsoil depth. So this is what we see in our fields, and we want to get a map of this because if we're growing a crop on these 2 different areas, the crop is going to respond to fertilizer differently. So In essence, that's what we're doing. We want to get a map of this. How do we do that? We go out and we physically map your fields with our mapping trucks. So I included a picture of one of our mapping truck setups. And you can see this contraption here. That's our swap box. And it's got an EM38 in it, which is measuring electrical conductivity, or EC. And then we've also got an RTK base station set up. And as the truck's driving along, it's measuring, or it's capturing topography and elevation data. So with these two layers, the EC layer and the elevation topography layer, we're capturing a number of things. One of them is soil texture differences. So the EC layer will pick up on, it'll delineate where the lighter textured soils are in your fields compared to the heavier textured soils. So we can manage those areas appropriately. If you have salinity, the EC layer does a really good job of picking up where the salinity is. So we can manage saline areas separately from the rest of the field. Even if you don't have high salinity, there's often areas of the field with light salinity that maybe is invisible to the naked eye, but it does have an impact, or it might have an impact on crop yield and for sure fertilizer response. And then of course, we're capturing water runs, depressions, and hilltops. So if you think of your own field as you're combining them and it's not yielding the same corner to corner, you have variability in your fields. Now, what causes that variability can be 100 different things. It could be man-made, it could be related to insects, it could be related to weed pressure, it could be related to 100 different things, or it could be related to some fertility-based factors. So things like the soil. Across your landscape, you might have different topsoil depths and organic matter levels, and that might be having an impact on yield. Water, where is it dry versus where is it wet? That's going to have a huge impact on how the crop's yielding and how the crop is going to respond to fertilizer. And then of course, topography as well. So I have another example SWOT map overlaid on a 3D model. And again, the 3D model is exaggerated. It looks like there's mountains in this field. There's not. But you can just really see that these high and dry hilltops are their own zone, their zone 1 and 2. And then as you go into the mid slopes and depressions, all the water collecting areas of the field are these zone 9 and 10s. So this map does a really good job of capturing fertility-based variability. Where is it dry? Where is it wet? Where are the different soils? And this is really important. One last step before we officially choose a SWOT map for your field is, us agronomists, we go out and we ground truth it. So what we're doing with ground truthing is we're driving around your field and making sure that the map matches your field perfectly. So if the agronomist is driving around in this field and they're in the zone 1 area on the map, they better be on the highest and driest part of the field when they're out there. On that opposite end of the spectrum, the zone 9 and 10, so this particular field has really high salinity. In this example, not even kochia grows in those highly saline spots. So when you're ground truthing a field like this, all the really high saline spots need to be in a zone 10 so that we can manage them separately from the rest of the field. Not every field has salinity. So if you don't have salinity, then the zone 10 needs to be your most water collecting area of the field. It needs to be there. It needs to be the area of the field where all the water runs to after a big rainstorm. So that's what ground truthing is. We're just making sure the map matches the field perfectly. Once we have the map, then we go out and soil test it. So our zone maps are 10 zones, but we sample to 5 zones. And sampling to 5 zones gives us a really good idea of what's going on in the field. If you compare that to composite soil testing, with composite soil testing, you're collecting soil from just the mid-slope areas of the field, putting it in one bag and sending it off to the lab. It's a 1-zone soil testing procedure, whereas we're sampling 5 zones. So a 10-zone map, we sample 5 So we do the extremes. So the ones, the sampling truck, the agronomist is out here. They're collecting soil from all the ones and putting it in a bag, sending it off to the lab. And it makes sense that that soil is all grouped together because it's the lightest textured soil, it's the driest soil. So it's going to respond to fertilizer similarly. On the other end of the spectrum, the 5s, these are all the most wet. If you have salinity, they're the most saline areas of the field. They get grouped together and sent to the lab. And then 3 zones in between. So these points are all GPS referenced. So we still test them every fall. So not only do we get a good idea of what's going on in the field in a given year, we can measure how things are looking over time as well. So how are SWOT maps different? Like I said, this is a map based on soil properties. And this is really important because we're applying inputs to the soil. It makes sense that we're starting with a map that is also based on the soil. And SWOT maps can give you the answer to why your crop is yielding the way it is in certain parts of the field. And then maybe you can start managing them appropriately. Compare that to making zone maps using yield or satellite imagery. Those have a fit in certain instances, but they don't give you the why. They just tell you what your crop yielded at a given time. And the problem with them is that they can group areas of the field together that have completely different soil characteristics. So what I mean by that is you might have a medium yielding hilltop, and you might also have a medium yielding depression in your field. So a zone map using satellite imagery is going to group those 2 areas together. They're both medium yielding. But if you look at the soil in those 2 areas, they're completely different. The crop is going to respond to fertilizer different. They should be managed differently. So that's really, in essence, how we're different. Once you have a zone map using SWOT maps, now you have a map that groups areas of the field together that respond to fertilizer similarly. So this is really important as well. So to wrap up the intro portion of this webinar, not all variable rate is the same. We go out and we physically map your fields and map your soil potential. And at the end of the day, your zone map matches your field perfectly. And that zone map doesn't change because elevation and EC don't change over time. The soil test levels might change. That's why we soil test every year. But the map itself is your map. The last point is just saying that every field and everybody's fields and soil test results are different. So what is the value of SWOT maps? How can we make you money, or how much money can we make you? We could give you 10 different examples and strategies of ways we could provide value. And some of those ways will be cumulative, more than one will apply. Some of them you might put more weight on in certain fields than others, but in the short term and definitely in the long term, you will see value to using SWOT maps. We do have a greater than 95% client retention rate. And so that's just saying our clients are having success with variable rate using SWOT maps. If we weren't providing value to them, if they didn't feel like we were making them money, they could leave us. We don't make anyone sign multi-year contracts or anything like that. So our clients are having success with variable rates using SWOT maps because we're starting with a really good base. We're starting with a map that is based on the soil. So with that, I'll take it back to Chris. Thank you.
Thanks, Carrie. Now it's time to take a more practical look at our SWOT map system. In this portion, we will hear from Carrie again, so we don't need to introduce her a second time. However, she will be joined by Jill Sparrow, another one of our local SWOT maps agronomy experts. Jill is a precision agronomist here at Crop Pro, and she's also our soil sampling lead. Jill is an articling agrologist who comes from the Vanscoy area. She grew up on a mixed cattle and grain farm and currently makes her home in Tisdale. Jill is a University of Saskatchewan grad where she received her degree in agriculture with a major in agronomy and a minor in ag business. She joined Crop Pro in the spring of 2019. So Jill and Carrie work together to cover Melfort, Tisdale, and basically all areas of northern Saskatchewan. They have a large number of clients in this region with a wide variety of agronomic challenges, often caused by soil variability. Today, they're going to show us how they successfully use SWAP technology to help their clients overcome these challenges. They'll be highlighting fields from near Prince Albert, so we want to thank Rob Dewick for allowing us to speak on some of his fields. Thank you, Rob. So without any further delay, let's hear from Carrie and Jill.
So now's the fun part where we'll go through specific strategies and ways that we can provide value to you. How do you make money using SWAP maps? So I mentioned just a little bit before that we could give 10 different examples and ways that we can provide value. In the interest of time, we've chosen just a few here to expand on in more detail, but there are more. The first one is you'll get a higher return on investment on applied nutrients. So you've got your fertilizer budget already. We're just putting that money in areas of the field where the crop will respond to it more. So you'll get more yield per dollar spent on your fertilizer. The second way is we help even out crop staging and maturity. This is really important for fungicide staging as well as harvest maturity. And we do all that by providing non-biased agronomic advice. So we are independent, we don't sell any inputs, and all of our suggestions and recommendations have your best interests in mind. So we've done a few of these webinars now, and they've all been regional. And this one's the Northern or Northeast Sask regional webinar, because that's where Jill and myself are based out of. So I threw up a map of our area and the soil zones, as well as the red outline is kind of where Jill and I are more focused around. That's where most of our clients are. What's unique to this area is that we deal with a lot of gray and dark gray soil zones. We also have large areas of black soil zones as well. What's unique to northern Saskatchewan compared to the rest of the province is that in general, we have a shorter growing season, as well as higher moisture totals. We typically get more rain. So fungicides, they're more often a necessity. We don't really debate if they're going to pay or not, because most years conditions are conducive for disease development. Timely harvest is important. That's related to our shorter growing season. Flooding risk, if you think of your farm in the past 15 years, how many times have your depressions or water collecting areas either completely flooded out or had severe moisture stress risk? And you'll see as we go along here, our fertilizer recommendations that we make actually help mitigate some of the risks associated with flooding. Another thing that's unique to our area is there can be a really large variability in organic matter and topsoil depth across a single field. So in our area, we often see there's a higher prevalence of peat, really high organic matter depressions. Not every field has peat, but within the province itself, if you're going to find peaty areas, it's going to be where we work, where this region is. So pop quiz, I've got two different soils here. In which soil will crops respond to fertilizer the most, assuming moisture is not the limiting factor? You got this soil on the left. It's 3.1% organic matter, 15 pounds of nitrate, and only 13 pounds of sulfate. And compare that to the soil on the right. You've got 7.6% organic matter, 35 pounds of nitrate, and it's loaded with sulfate. Plus you could tell it's got a heavier textured, it's heavier textured as well. So which soil will crops respond to fertilizer the most? It's going to be this one on the left, because this soil doesn't have the same level of background inherent fertility. It's more deficient in everything. This soil will, if you grow a crop on this soil, and it's not moisture limited, it can grow a decent crop. It just needs a little more help in order for the nutrients not to run out. It needs a little more fertilizer. Whereas this soil over here, it had more nutrients in it, plus it has the ability to release more nutrients on its own in a given year through mineralization. So keep this in mind as Jill goes through the next section, and I'll let her take over now.
All right, so I'm going to be talking about our first value proposition, which is getting a high return on your investment through applied nutrients. So basically all we are doing here is taking your existing fertilizer budget and we are reallocating that budget to areas of the field where the crop will respond more, and vice versa. We'll be scaling back on areas of the field where the crop won't respond as much to fertilizer applications. If we take a look at this first slide here, these trends in organic matter are what we see 95% of the time. Where in our hilltops, we have lower organic matter. Then as we move into our mid slopes and even further into the depressions, we'll see a higher amount of organic matter that has been accumulated. Now, when we're talking about nitrogen mineralization, we're talking about how much nitrogen the soil will release on its own throughout the growing season. And there are plenty of factors that play into nitrogen mineralization potential, but the two main ones to consider are organic matter and moisture. So if we pay attention to this depression, we have higher organic matter. These are the areas of the field that are going to hold and collect more water. And so as a result, these areas are also going to be releasing more nitrogen on their own than this hilltop would be that has lower organic matter and is your high and dry spot of the field. This field here is a field of one of our clients, Rob Dewick, up by Meath Park. And our swap map here is in 3D version. We've also exaggerated that 3D version just to more clearly show you the difference between the hilltops and the depressions on this map. The numbers you see on that map are our soil test points where we take from every single year. So if we focus on the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, this first soil picture here is our hilltop, so our zone 1 and 2. We have lower organic matter, your high and dry zones of the field, and a lighter textured soil. As we move into our mid-slope, we see that increase in organic matter, and even if you're just looking at the soil test pictures there, you can see that color difference in soil from the hilltop to this mid-slope. Working further into our depression, you can see that increase in organic matter. These are our areas of the field that are going to hold, collect more water, and have a heavier textured soil to them as well. This second row of numbers here is our soil test nitrate levels. And throughout this field, you can see that we have pretty low nitrate residual. We see a slight bump at 28 pounds in that depression, but overall nothing super significant in the end. This third row of numbers is how much nitrogen we estimate to be mineralized throughout the growing season. So if we look back into our hilltop, you can see we're only estimating 15 pounds of nitrogen to be mineralized. Our mid-slopes, we're estimating 30 pounds, and our depression, we're estimating 60 pounds of nitrogen to be mineralized. So overall, if we're looking at our zone 1 to 5 or 1 to 6, if these areas of the field get adequate enough moisture, these are the areas that are going to respond to fertilizer application the most. And the reason being is that they don't have as much background fertility. So we're only getting 25 to 45 pounds of background soil nitrogen in these zones. Whereas if we look at this depression, we're getting 88 pounds of background nitrogen to the soil, from the soil. So for these depressions, it doesn't make sense to load on as much fertilizer in these areas if we're already getting more background fertility given to us by the soil. This is a VR report for that field. And if we take a look at our nitrate levels from the fall of 2018, you can see we have pretty low residual nitrogen again, with that slight bump in our zone 9 and 10s in those depressions. Looking at our recommended rate of anhydrous, the rates here are in pounds of actual nitrogen and not pounds of anhydrous product. So in our zones 1 to 4, we're putting on 120 pounds of actual nitrogen. And the reason being is we have a lower nitrate residual, lower organic matter, our high and dry zones of the field. And so these areas of the field are going to respond to fertilizer more. Moving into our mid slopes, our zone 5 and 6, we're slowly starting to decrease those nitrogen rates. And the main reason being here is we're starting to see that increase in organic matter. And moving into our depressions, so in our zone 9, we're putting 90 pounds of actual nitrogen, and in our zone 10, we're putting 75 pounds of actual nitrogen. We're doing this and we're dropping those rates more because we have an even higher increase in organic matter. We're starting to see higher nitrate residual, our water collecting zones of the field, and so we have more background fertility given to us from the soil, as well as higher nitrogen mineralization rates. If we pay attention to our average here for the field, we're applying on average 112 pounds of actual nitrogen. So for example, if we're going to go flat rate this field at 112 pounds, what areas of the field are we going to be over applying nitrogen? And what areas of the field are we going to be under applying nitrogen? Moving on to sulfur here, these trends in sulfur are typically what we see 95 to 99% of the time. We're on our hilltops, we have lower sulfur. Then as we move into our mid slopes, and again, even further into our depressions, we'll see that higher amount of sulfur that has been accumulated. Sulfur moves quite readily with water, so wherever water moves, sulfur follows. And mineralization also plays a role in sulfur as well, but not to the extent that it does with nitrogen. Up here in the north, we can also get some fields that have quite sandy ridges, and with that sand comes higher leaching potential for the sulfur. This is a trial done at our research site in Nacum this past summer. So if you look to the graph on the left, these are our soil test sulfur levels. And you can see from zones 1 to 8, we have pretty low sulfur in the field and no significant difference between those zones. We see a bump in sulfur when we hit that zone 10. If we're looking at these two canola pictures, both of these canola pictures had 0 pounds of sulfur applied, yet you can see there is a visual difference between the two. So our zone 1 and 2, again, our hilltops, you can see that leaf cupping. There is some sulfur deficiency here. Whereas if we look into our toe slopes and depressions, you can see the crop looks quite healthy. So if we're gonna go put sulfur down on a field, what areas of the field do we need to put more sulfur on? It's gonna be these hilltops where the crop is gonna need it more, and you're gonna see a more visual response from that fertilizer. We're not gonna completely cut back and put our sulfur down, or put no sulfur down at all in these lower zones, but we can cut back significantly because the crop won't respond as much to fertilizer applications, and we already have that background fertility given to us. This is another field of Rob's. You can see here in our hilltops, these areas of the field are quite low in organic matter and are actually quite sandy. And so our soil sulfur corresponds with that, where we have low sulfur in these areas of the field. If we look into our zone 9 and 10, we see that increase in organic matter. So organic matter is quite high here. And as a result, we see that soil sulfur be quite high as well. Our recommended rates for our sulfur for this field, so in our zones 1 to 2 on our hilltops, we're applying 140 pounds of fines. And the reason being here is we have that higher leaching potential, our higher and drier zones of the field, so the crop is going to need and respond to more fertilizer here. We're cutting way back into our depressions because we see that bump in organic matter, that bump in soil sulfur, and so we have more background fertility and higher mineralization rates as well. Looking at our average, we're applying 124 pounds of fines to this field. So again, if we're gonna go flat rate this field, what areas of the field are gonna get an over application and what areas of the field are gonna be under applied? So what about phos, potassium, and other micronutrients? So we could keep showing you examples after example and go way over our time allocated for us this morning. But the main things to consider here is, like the nutrients I already talked about, we're not going to be following the same trends as those, but we still need to consider response characteristics, soil properties, and of course soil tests when we recommend fertilizer rates for each zone for each of these nutrients. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Carrie, and she's going to talk about our second value proposition.
Thanks, Jill. So the second way that we can provide value to you is by evening out crop staging and maturity. So what is the value of a timely harvest and not having to wait for green and delayed depressions? And also, what is the value of evening out crop staging across all areas of the field during key fungicide staging times? So I've got a picture of a canola field here a little later in the season, and you can see these hilltops are already starting to mature. And in the same field, you've got grass green depressions. So what caused this variability? Was it drier up here, so the crop was pushed to maturity faster? Did it maybe not have enough required nutrients? And in these depressions, was plant stand lower here? So the canola plants were branching way more and that delayed maturity. Are there excess nutrients here? Can we manipulate this variability with fertilizer and seeding rates? So Jill kind of talked about this a little bit already, where can we put more fertilizer on the hilltops to maybe keep them greener a little longer and cut back the fertilizer in these depressions because it's usually already loaded with nutrients? What about seeding rates? So with variable rate seed, the goal with it is we want to hit the target plant stand across all areas of the field. Doesn't matter where you are, you want to have the same plant stand across the field. And how we do that is we increase the seeding rates in higher mortality areas. So thinking about that, what areas of the field typically have higher seedling mortality? It's your hills and depressions. So with the hills, usually drier up there, you might be seeding a little bit shallower, often more insect pressure up there. Could be sandy, it could be hard, lumpy structure, and all those things are affecting how the seed establishes and germinates. And then on the other end of the spectrum, in the depression areas, if you're seeding a little bit early, you might be mudding it in a bit. So the seed is going to have a hard time coming up and establishing because of that. Those areas of the field are usually cooler. You might have flood and water stress risk. If you have peat, you might have peat and or salinity. That's going to have an impact on how the seed emerges and establishes. So keeping that in mind, those are the areas with higher mortality. So we put more seed there. So I've got an example prescription on the left from one of Rob's fields and a corresponding plant stand count report for later in the year. So looking at this VR prescription, if we focus on the wheat column, the wheat layer, each column on this report is like a tank in the drill. So with the wheat layer, you can see on average on this field, we put on 145 pounds an acre of seed. And we determine that based on the germ and TKW of the seed lot. Every seed lot's different, so that's why we take into account germ and TKW when we make that recommendation. But then you can see within the field and different areas of the field how we change the seeding rate depending on where we were. So on zones 1 and 2, that's your high and dry hilltops, we put on more seed, 155 and 150 pounds an acre of seed. Then in the mid-slope areas, zones 3 to 6, we actually cut back a little bit to 140 pounds an acre because these areas don't really have the high mortality like the other areas do. So we can cut back a little bit. And then in the depressions, we crank it up again, all the way to 175 pounds an acre. So that's what Rob applied in the spring. We went out several weeks later to do plant stand counts, which we do these plant stand counts by zone on every farm every year. And we've done thousands of these now. It's a really good report card to see if the strategy we applied in the spring made sense for this field and this farm. So if we look at this, what happened here, zones 1 and 2, your hills, we hit 28 plants per square foot. The mid slopes, we were at about 31 plants per square foot. And then in the zone 9 and 10 water collecting areas, we were at about 29 plants per square foot. So we were targeting 30 plants. So this is a really good plant stand count across the entire field. This is pretty even. No concerns here. Remember though that we put more seed on those hills and depressions, and it's not like we ended up with way more seed or way more plants at the end of the day. We hit target. So if you back calculate what the actual mortality was in each of these regions, you can see that on the hills we were at 20%, mid slopes not as much, only 10%. In depressions we were at 25%. So every field and farm are different. This is the general trend we see though. Maybe the mortality within each zone could be different depending on what's going on in those zones. But this is what happened on one of Rob's fields. If we're going to pick on fusarium, the fusarium disease and fungicide spraying for it, we know that those fusarium fungicide products have a narrow window of application, plus they're rated at suppression at best. So we want to give that product the best chance possible at doing a good job. And the way you do that is by having a really even crop as it comes into the correct staging. So I got some pictures from my colleague in Yorkton, Hannah. This is from the same farm. It's one of the clients she works with. And the only difference is this field had variable rate fertilizer and seed using swap maps. And this field was flat rate fertilizer and seed. The fields were only 1 mile apart, but this one just isn't mapped yet. So you can see in the zone 2s, this is your shoulder slopes, your water shedding areas. The heads are coming out of the boot. And also in the zone 8 depressions, the heads are also coming out of the boot here. It's a nice even field. But then when you look at the flat rate field, what would likely be a zone 2, this is your water shedding areas. The heads are coming out of the boot here, but in the same field, what would likely be a zone 8, your depressions, you can see the heads aren't even cracking the boot yet. They're delayed. So this timing a field like this for fungicide is going to be a lot harder than a field like this. So by having an even field, you're going to get better fusarium control, which means you're going to get a better grade and more profit. You've made the decision to spray a fungicide for fusarium. By giving it the best chance possible, that's how you make more profit. Looking at later in the season when the crop's coming into maturity, I've got a picture of a field of wheat where the entire field is coming into maturity nice and evenly, including in these depressions. There's maybe a couple little green spots, but overall, this is a nice even field. And if you would consider what we would have done if we would have flat rated this field, which would have meant we would have put way more fertilizer than was required in these depressions, they probably would be really green, maybe lodged. And lodged and green depressions cost time at harvest, and we're not really gaining yield there. You're going to have an increased frost risk in those areas, and that's going to maybe reflect on the quality of the sample at the end of the day. So that's what we're doing with variable rate fertilizer and seed using swap maps. We're trying to get this all evened out. And if you are using a different VR provider right now, really ask them if they are able to delineate where the hills versus depressions are, because that's really what you need to do in order to have an even maturing field. Got another example field here. This one's actually a field by Tisdale now, and it's a half section, and 20 or 30 acres of this half section has a really high organic matter PD flat to it. So you can see the soil test from this area. It was 32% organic matter, really high, and 90 pounds of nitrate. And in this area, we only apply 25 pounds of nitrogen to it. Look how green it still is. But consider how green and lodged it would be if we put the flat rate of 110 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So not only how much money did we save on fertilizer, how much time did we also save at harvest? So this is a pretty extreme examples that we deal with quite regularly, but even if you don't have this extreme of an example, this is kind of the same strategy that we apply to all fields. We maybe aren't as aggressive at cutting back the nitrogen as this example, but it's definitely better than flat rating the field. So the third way we can provide value is you've got an independent agronomist in your corner. There are a lot of fertilizer products out there. There's a lot of things to consider with fertilizer placements and rates. So we can help you sort through that noise. The other thing is we don't just give you prescriptions and you never hear from us again. We do a couple on-farm visits, like the plant stand counts, and we go crop checking during the pre-harvest timing to really ensure and make sure that our strategies we're using on your farm make sense for your fields. We also do spring meetings, and you always have an agronomist that you can call and bounce ideas off of. So to wrap up, why choose SWOT maps? We are making a map based on soil potential. And if you compare that to yield potential maps, there's a big difference. We always have your best interests in mind. So we talked about dealing with staging and maturity challenges. How do we manage that? How do we allocate your fertilizer budget? We talked about peats. We didn't really talk about salinity and acidic soils, but we can manage those areas appropriately too, which would be relevant to northern Saskatchewan as well. Also didn't talk about drainage plans, but since we have the RTK elevation data for your field, we can provide drainage plans to you at no extra cost. So some of our clients do that as well. We do have software that's free for farmers to use. So it's called SWOT Records. It used to be called Crop Records. It's going through a name change right now. And it's a really handy tool. For our crop scouting clients, we put all the scouting observations and spray records in there. It's really handy for that. A lot of our variable rate clients use this app to see their maps on their phone, and it's GPS reference. So you can actually open up your map on your phone and drive around and ground truth it yourself if you want. So that's really handy as well, and it's no extra cost for farmers to use. So I'll finish off with saying we are a team on your farm. We provide support for you throughout the season, and with that, I'll take it back or bring it back to Chris to tell you about our mapping offer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Jill. Excellent job. I was going to turn on my video. I think, Coral, if you don't mind giving me the permission to do that, then we can move on. But in any event, this is our mapping offer. For those of you that are new to Crop Pro and you're in attendance today, obviously, all you need to do is map 160 acres this spring, and we will give you $1,000 in credit towards the invoice for that work. We'd just like you to make sure you put your name and phone number in the chat box so that we can get in touch with you and work out any details. And as those of you who are clients will already know from your invitation, you can also qualify for this $1,000 mapping credit for any new mapping that you do this spring, as long as it's at least 160 acres. And as long as you referred somebody to this webinar, that it will also become a new client. So again, just make sure you let us know in the chat box who you are and who you referred as well, so that we can connect you to the new client. My contact information is on the screen there. So reach out to me either by email or by phone. And as I say, use the chat box to let us know who you are as well. So go ahead and continue to think of questions, write them in the question and answer and we'll be sure to get them answered for you. In the meantime, we do have questions here to ask and get answers for. So I'll start out with a question for Jill. And it says here, in one of your examples, you said the zone 10 area was getting 80 plus pounds of nitrogen through mineralization, yet you still put on 75 pounds of nitrogen on that field. Why? Go ahead, Jill, if you want to answer that one.
Yeah, for sure. So in those cases, we're just estimating mineralization. And with that estimation, we don't want to have cases where we cut back on nitrogen too much and risk the crop being nitrogen deficient, especially in cases where we don't get a high mineralization year. Like I said in my video, mineralization is quite dependent on temperature, moisture, so weather. So in those cases, we want to play on the side of more slightly over applying than severely under applying.
Right. Okay. Very good. Next question. This one's for Carrie. Do you always put the highest rate of fertilizers on the hilltops? What if I have beach sand in my field?
Yeah, so couple things to consider is how sandy are we talking and what area of the province are we talking about. But generally speaking, no, we don't put the highest rates of fertilizer on beach sand because generally speaking, beach sand areas are going to always be limited by moisture. That's where the yield potential is going to be limited. Now, with that said, sandy areas are usually very deficient in everything. So maybe we could make a targeted approach to address some of the things that are affecting yield to help improve. There's things you can do to help improve yield and water retention, but generally speaking, no, it's we don't put the highest rates. We consider where we are in the province. I know there's people listening from all over. So if you're in a drier area of the province or you're in a dry cycle, then you know that yield is going to definitely be limited. Some years up north, the sandier areas were the highest yielding parts of the field because they didn't flood out. So it's a case by case basis.
Okay, very good. Okay, we have another question here. Are you doing any variable rate fungicide application maps? Jill, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, for sure. We are doing variable rate fungicide maps. So it's, again, a case-by-case basis. Sometimes we can do them based on our swap maps. Other cases, we'll actually use NDVI imagery and do fungicide application maps that way. Typically, what we do for that is just an on and off prescription. Right.
Yeah, I was going to ask that question as a follow-up. It's not really variable rate fungicide, is it? It's more of an on and an off. It's either you need it or you don't. So cool. Another question I'll fire out to you, Carrie, if you want to take this one. It might have been answered in our presentation, but how do you get or calculate your average seeding rates for the field?
Yeah, so every seed lot is different. There's different TKWs of your seed. So we have to take those things into consideration and your germ as well. So we have your target plant stand, the germ, the TKW, and then we put it in a seeding rate calculator. And that's how we get the average seeding rate for the field. And then of course we vary within the field itself, depending on the mortalities within the field.
Right. Right. Okay.
So heavier, I guess I should meant like heavier seed, you need to put more of it down to get the same number of plants at the end of the day.
Okay, very good. A question that gets asked fairly often is about mapping in the spring, especially from new folks who are considering doing variable rate through Crop Pro in the springtime. Can we get it done in time to get them prescriptions? You go ahead, Jill, if you want to answer that one. Can we do it in the spring?
Yeah, for sure. We definitely can do some mapping in the spring and soil sampling. I guess the struggle with mapping in the spring versus the fall is we have more of a time crunch. And generally, when you can get on the field to seed, is the same time that we can get on the field and map and soil sampling. So there is that time crunch, but yeah, we can get, and we try to get it done in the spring.
Yeah, and I often tell people that we haven't been burned yet. Mother Nature is ultimately the boss, but we have tremendous horsepower and ability to get acres covered. So we've been very, very successful at getting new acres mapped in the springtime. And while Jill, you are right, when they get to the field, we basically get in similar time. But we can go a little earlier because soil temperature is a concern for seeding, not a concern for us. As soon as we can get into the field with a truck, we can give her, and we haven't been burned yet. Hopefully Mother Nature agrees this spring too. But okay, another comment that I wanted to make for those of you interested, especially in the region around Melfort and Nacum areas, that we have our research site that we started last year. It's called our PARS research site, or Precision Agriculture Research Site. It's just outside of Nacum. It was a tremendous success last year, and we're doing it again this year. We'll be growing wheat on that section of land, quarter section. And I guess it worked out to 100 acres, I think it is. And there's going to be some tremendous learning there again this year. So I would encourage you to stay in touch with Crop Pro. If you're on social media at all, pay attention to it, because there will be announcements about dates and tours and things that we can do. We managed the social distancing exceedingly well last year using spaced out tours. So I think it was over a 3-week period of time that we did our tours, and we limited the numbers for each one. It was a morning and an afternoon session. We'll be probably doing something similar again this year, but I would encourage you to take part in that. It's tremendous learning. So that's something to keep in mind. And also, I wanted to mention the SWAT Agronomy podcast that we just started. So if you're interested in learning about SWAT Agronomy, it's not just going to be Crop Pro staff, it's going to be other people, guest speakers as well. So go to your favorite your audio podcast platform that you prefer and just search SWAT Agronomy podcast and you'll find it. But I don't see any more questions popping up. It must be that you two ladies did a fantastic job of presenting and all the answers were given. So I don't know if there's more, if there's something else that I've missed. Carrie or Jill, is there something that you feel that we should share?
Maybe we should touch on salinity a little bit, just because in our
Sure.
examples, we didn't talk about it at all, but
Sure.
I know we have
Okay.
listeners that have.
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. Yeah, Jill, why don't you go ahead and handle that one? How do we manage salinity?
Yeah, so we manage salinity. So you have different levels of salinity in your field. So we manage those on a case-by-case basis. They're different based on your levels of salinity. But in all cases, we aggressively cut back fertilizer in those zones, mainly being because, again, you have a lower yield potential, and there's typically a lot of fertilizer already in those areas. In some cases where your drill is capable and it's a large saline area, then you can, then we can cut back fertilizer entirely and not put anything on there. It's common for us to also increase our seeding rates. Mainly being is we're trying to get something to grow there, trying to get some competition against the weeds that like to grow there, like kochia, and also soak up that excess water in those areas. We may not increase seeding rates in those areas. It's kind of a case-by-case basis, especially depending on the crop that is grown there. For example, canola seed is more expensive than cereal seed. So if you're planting a canola year, we might not increase seeding rates in those zones.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, well, I would just say one thing before I let everyone go. If you have already put your name and contact information into the chat box, I thank you for that. But maybe there are some of you who are not yet ready to do some mapping, or not ready to take advantage of the program that we have, but you just want more information. Certainly put your name and number in there as well, and let us know. And either myself or Carrie or Jill or somebody from the staff will get in contact with you and answer whatever questions you may have. Oh, I do see one question pop up we better answer. Does the producer choose his base rate based on his financial risk or general management style? Go ahead, Gary, you can take that one.
Yeah, for sure. It's kind of like we work with all budgets and all systems, and we try to work with you, right? So we're not coming in there and making you change everything. We're usually, generally speaking, we're working with your budget already. We're just reallocating within the field. With that said, I guess it depends on what you're doing. We obviously are always trying to help you improve. So if there's something glaringly, something we want to address, then of course we'll bring it up. But we do work with every budget. We're just varying within the field using your existing, what you're doing already.
Ultimately, it is still your farm. You are still the boss, and you make that final say. So, okay, I think we covered it to the best of our ability. But as I say, reach out to us if you'd like more information on any of the topics or on the credit as well. So thank you for your time, everyone, and we'll let you get back to the business of your farm. Take care.